Mary, thank you for talking with me about common reasons why people leave the faith and giving your perspective, not only on what a young person might be going through, but also how a mom might respond to their child if he or she is struggling with the faith. I think your perspective is really valuable. So thank you for having this conversation with me.
Absolutely.
We're on our second reason. We dealt last time with scandal and the bad witness of certain people who might be in a position of authority, but then they really mess up and how damaging that can be on a young person and what a mom might say to help that child through that crisis. And today we're going to talk about the problem of evil, a very big reason why many people leave the church. In fact, another one of my daughters, your sister Lee, one of the girls in her class has said that she and her mom both decided that they are atheists because of the problem of evil. They said they just can't wrap their head around how there could be a God who is all loving but also all powerful. If he's all loving and has the power to stop bad things, why wouldn't he? So that is the actual reason why the girl who sits next to her in school is not a Christian. And so it's just a really serious, I mean, I know other people as well. They're who struggle with the problem of evil. And it's just a perennial issue in our church. So we're being brave to take it on today. Just little old you and me trying to figure out the problem of evil.
You're very right that this is a problem that everybody I know, including myself, goes through, because it's really counterintuitive to think of a really good God in the midst of any suffering or issues that we go through in our lives. And I know that even a lot of Bible stories and saints' lives really harp on this dynamic. But the most important thing that I'd say is that as human beings, we have a natural instinct to protect ourselves. And that impulse is just a gut reaction, as well as also blaming or being angry at the person or group who would have caused or allowed the suffering to happen in your life. And so it's really important to know that that is just how our human nature works, and it has, good reasons for that, but that when it comes to our relationship with God, whenever we go through suffering, it's really important to know that there's always a bigger picture. There's a lot of meaning behind everything that we go through, and that God uses even suffering and even problems. He allows us to face these things because He's trying to tell us something, because He's going to use that to overcome those evils.
Yes, if you think about it in the Bible, so many of the figures gained their sanctity through challenges and through suffering. And Christ himself, as the Son of God, suffers even to the point of death on a cross. And so, at the very least, a first pass at a response to the problem of evil is that God himself does not avoid it, but he actually enters into evil, sin, suffering, and death. And while he himself did not sin, he took on the sin of humanity and suffered for it, and so suffered for us. And so we know that the goal as Christians is not to try to avoid all pain and suffering, but to try to enter into it in, you could call it a sanctified way or a divine way, a Christ like way, that we taking on a death like his would hopefully also enjoy a resurrection like his, as St. Paul says. Another figure in the Bible that comes to mind is Job. So, classically, the Old Testament book of Job is a locus classicus for dealing with the problem of evil. And we ask, what is the Judeo Christian response to the problem of evil? And a lot of people look to the book of Job for that. Job was a really righteous man, the most righteous man in the land, and he starts to suffer every conceivable kind of evil. He loses his wife, all of his children, his land, his possessions, and then even his health. And he breaks out into a horrible skin disease and is just suffering so pitifully and utterly. And so he cries out to God, I curse the day that I was born. And I find it really interesting. I have studied the book of Job. I've really looked into what is God's answer to the problem of evil presented, at least in that sacred text. A noteworthy feature about it is that the figure of Job is the only character who stays in conversation with God. Job speaks to God in the second person singular, you, Lord, blah, blah, blah. And every other character talks about God. His wife does first before she dies. Three of his friends come and they talk about God, but it's always in the third person. Scholars have noted that that is a first response in the book of Job to the problem of evil. It's an encouragement for us to stay in dialogue with God, stay in conversation with God. I mean, Job is not speaking kindly to God. He's really, really upset. I mean, to curse the day that you were born in the ancient Near East was about as intense of a chastisement of God as it got. But the point that I think the book of Job is making is that God can handle that and that it's better for us to be honest with God, bare our souls to God. And I've heard the expression, God's shoulders are very broad. Don't be afraid to speak honestly to God. He can take it. Just keep talking to him.
I really like that saying. And I think that you're very right that there is really a lot of power in being able to come to God as like a real relationship. In any relationship that you have with anybody else, you are sometimes angry with them or you're frustrated or you're really happy with them, but you talk to them about it all the same and you work on it. And that's how you can grow and strengthen your relationship with someone else, especially by working issues. And so I think that it's really important to understand that if you want to have a living faith, you have to treat it like any other relationship to a certain degree, that you can go to God when you're angry and tell him that you're angry and ask him what he's trying to do with this, because then instead of just cutting God out of your life, you're going to him and it is still prayer. It is still going to improve and strengthen your faith even in the midst of the worst things that you go through.
Yeah, lament is a very valid form of prayer. And Job is lamenting, and there are lament psalms. The Old Testament really gives us lament as one of the primary ways of communicating with God. So we shouldn't think that we're less of a Christian or weakening in our faith when we are lamenting what we're going through and asking God, why have you let this happen to me? And in fact, I mean, it's very tender that Christ himself speaks the cry of dereliction on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? There's so much scriptural scholarship on what exactly was going through Christ's mind. Was he actually feeling the absence of the Father, or was he actually making a profession of faith because he's quoting a psalm that starts off with that, but then it continues in like an acknowledgement of God's goodness and a statement of praise. And so scholars are divided on how to interpret the cry of dereliction. Nevertheless, Christ himself on the cross engages in a prayer of lament. So we know that it has been endorsed for us. We can use that form of prayer as well. Then, skipping to the end of Job, there's the classic answer to the problem of evil. It's in chapter 33. And God answers Job and he says to the effect, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I separated the water from the dry land and set the boundaries? Can you change the boundaries that I've set? And so God basically communicates to Job saying, I have got this. Don't second guess me. Trust that I know more than you, and keep your eyes on me, and let me be God and you be you. And that's really how Job is able to say, your ways are higher than my ways, and my ways are not your ways. And it's that that really is what so many Jews and Christians take to be a faithful answer to God. It's not a matter of really understanding a solution. It's more a matter of a faithful response. Job does not give us some sort of behind the scenes look at why a good and all powerful God would allow so much suffering and evil in the world. But I do believe that as Christians, our job is to humble ourselves before God and let God be God and acknowledge that his ways are just higher than our ways. One of my favorite Bible verses is Romans 8:28. I probably made you memorize it when you were a little girl. I try to have everybody memorize Romans 8:28. All things are for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. All things are good for those who love God. So that means the favorable things, but also the misfortunes and the devastations. All things that happen to us are for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So I just try to remind myself, love God in the midst of this and trust that he has something good for you or for me in it.
Actually reminds me of another Bible verse and something that I had seen a couple months ago that has really, really changed my perspective on suffering. I had seen someone talk about the verse from, I believe it's Malachi chapter 3, verse 3, where it describes God as a silversmith and that he, purifies us as a silversmith purifies silver. And so someone got really curious and really wanted to go see what the details of that process is like. So he went and investigated and he talked to a real silversmith and watched this process. And the silversmith takes him through this whole thing about how have to take the silver and hold it in the hottest part of the flame, but you have to watch it very, very closely because if you keep it in for too little time, it'll not be as purified as it needs to be. But if you hold it even just a split second longer than it should, it completely corrupts or melts the
Mhm.
metal. And so the silversmith has to hold it in the center of this flame for just enough time and take enough precaution to really purify such a beautiful metal. And it was really life changing for this person and has now really been life changing for me too. That if that is the metaphor that God uses, how incredible is that he doesn't even though it can feel as though God is really abandoning us in our trials, or you can't really make sense of why he would allow us to go through certain things, and it can even feel like a betrayal as well as abandonment. It's actually the case that if he allows you to go through something, he hasn't left you, and he's has such a close, precise eye on you and is holding you through it. And he wants you so desperately to see that there is a bigger picture at the very least. But all of this is just to say that God uses these metaphors in the Bible, and they actually have a lot more meaning than I even realized. And that has really helped with my idea of suffering.
I like that a lot. What really stands out to me is that the silversmith has to hold the silver the whole time. So the silversmith couldn't just set it in the flame and walk away. There's care and attention to detail to make sure that it's just the right amount of time. So, one message we can take from that is that God is holding us even when we're in pain. We might feel like God has abandoned us, that God has deserted us. I mean, the lament cries in the scripture are very vocal about that feeling. And yet, I think God's answer is, I am right here with you. But even my own son suffered. It's just not God's way to protect his loved ones from suffering. He doesn't preserve us, even his own son, from suffering. The Son of God actually chose to take on suffering, even to the point of death. So I guess there's a message in there for us about having faith that God really is there and that we don't have to understand it in the moment. When we're in pain, just be in pain, experience it. You don't have to stop suffering in order to be sanctified. In fact, some of the greatest sanctity can come right in the middle of our worst pain.
Yes, you're completely right. I've really struggled myself with this idea of, okay, so I guess we just have to take on this indefinite amount of suffering and we're doomed to that. But last year I was taking a class and I was instructed to read this church encyclical, and it was really powerful. It's called Salvifici Dolores, which I think means like the joy of suffering. It's written by Pope John Paul II, and it's entirely about suffering and how it's salvific. First of all, it's what does actually allow us to be purified in different ways. It really strengthens us, it teaches us things, and it also is one of the closest ways to unite us to God, especially because of Christ's sacrifice. We are able to meet Christ face to face on the cross through our suffering if we choose to do so, if we choose to come to God in the midst of our struggles. And there is even joy. I think it's a little silly and counterintuitive to say, but there is joy to be found even in the worst situations, principally because you get to unite yourself so closely to God. And that is a good enough reason in and of itself, but also because there are almost always silver linings, and there is something that God is able to make out of such evil, that it shows that not only is God good because he allows us to experience good things, he's so good and he's so powerful that he can even turn the worst of the worst into something good. He can use it for good. So he can overcome even the worst evils. So in
Mm.
logically, I mean, I'm a worrywart and I'm not good at this, and I have roller coasters of emotions. But the truth that I try to cling to as much as possible is this, is that there is really joy to be found in the suffering, because you can have faith in God and that hope that he's there for you through it all, and that he is going to redeem you. He is going to use it to bring you into the glory of his resurrection, that you suffer with Christ and that you are then raised into his glory and redemptive powers through all of that. So suffering is kind of necessary sometimes.
Last time we talked about Catherine of Siena, and I have another great passage in her writings about being calm and still in the face of trials. And she has this great line. She says, we should even hold our suffering and our pain with reverence. I just think that's some kind of a thought. I mean, she's a doctor of the church. That's the kind of thing that a doctor of the church would say. Like, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna grin and bear it, or I'm gonna muscle through this. But she's like, I'm gonna hold this in reverence. So it's a lofty thing to attain, but it at least can help us just have the faith, just sort of like borrow a little bit of her faith that this is not an indication of the absence of God. This is an experience that God is letting us have to purify us, and we will come to the point of perfect communion with God.